Hello everyone, I'm Benjamin Anthony, co-founder of the MirYam Institute, the premier international forum for Israel-focused dialogue, discussion and debate. And we have got a fascinating debate to share with you today. You know, as Israel's star continues to rise on the international stage, we at the MirYam Institute want to push to the forefront Israel's unique expertise on matters of international importance, significance, and curiosity. In the debate that you're about to watch, we ponder and tackle the question of whether or not democracies can defeat terrorist organizations militarily. Arguing in the affirmative, we had the pleasure of hosting the former Deputy Military Advocate General of the Israel Defense Forces, retired Colonel Eli Bar-On. And he was joined by none other than Professor Alan Dershowitz. But they faced stiff opposition because arguing in the negative were none other than Colonel Richard Kemp, former commander of British forces in Afghanistan, and he was joined by human rights lawyer Professor Michel Paradis, Professor of Law at Columbia University in Manhattan, New York. It made for a fascinating conversation, and after the initial argumentations, we opened the floor to questioning from our expert moderators, which included retired US Navy SEALs, Special Forces operators, and more. I hope that you enjoy this debate, and I hope that you find the outcome as fascinating as I did. I also want to thank the team at JBS TV, who have given us the opportunity to broadcast this debate to you today, and I want to encourage you, the viewers, to invest in the work of jbstv.org via their website at the donate button. With that, I invite you to enjoy this debate where we ask the question, can democracies defeat terrorist organizations militarily? Good evening to everybody, dear friends. This evening we're going to wrestle with the question, can democracies win wars against terrorist organizations? Can democracies win wars against terrorist organizations? Ladies and gentlemen, each of our experts will make a 7-minute preliminary argument before the floor is opened to our moderator questions. After those questions, each debater will make a 2-minute summary statement. When 1 minute remains for the debaters to conclude their statement and their argument, they will see my face and they will hear this sound. Our live audience will be asked to vote twice. In just a moment, we will be asking all of you to cast your first vote. The result of that preliminary vote will remain hidden until the conclusion of the second vote. You will be asked to vote for a second time at the conclusion of the debate. The rule here is that whichever panel of debaters swings more votes over to their side will be declared the winner of this evening's debate. Now, tonight we are not polling the audience for their opinion. I want to be clear about that. Rather, we are asking you to stretch intellectually and dispassionately and to provide us with your view on which panel argues their case in the most convincing fashion. When you vote, we ask you to do so based upon which of our esteemed debaters presents the more compelling argumentation and position, which argument stands up best under the scrutiny of the opposition, and which is the more reasonable and logical position as you perceive it, pending the argumentations you're about to hear. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our first debater, Colonel Eli Bar-On. Eli Bar-On concluded his career in the Israel Defense Forces holding the position of instructor at the Israel Defense Forces National Defense College. Prior to that position, he served as the Deputy Military Advocate General of the Israel Defense Forces from 2012 to 2015, where he was in command of approximately 1,000 lawyers and legal experts, including prior to, during, and following Operation Pillar of Defense and Operation Protective Edge. Now, Eli, before you take to the floor, you oversaw 1,000 lawyers. Can you tell us, please, can there possibly be any experience worse than that?
Nothing like it.
Well, we hope you'll never have to do that again, Eli. May we know no future wars. But now, arguing in the affirmative in answer to the question, can democracies win wars against terrorist organizations? Colonel Eli Bar-On, we invite you to begin your 7 minutes now.
Thank you, Benjamin. It's midnight here in Israel. It's most definitely my favorite time of the day for debating. I want to thank you. I want to thank our audience for joining us. I want to thank Rosita, Alan, and the MirYam Institute for including me in this wonderful event with outstanding co-debaters. I would argue that democracies have won wars in the past and will keep winning wars in the future. Wars against terror organizations are no exception. And yet, it seems there is a real need to hold this debate. Winning wars against terror groups is challenging, period. The Soviet Union has fought Islamic rebels in Afghanistan, and Saudi Arabia has done the same in Yemen. Both these countries are not democracies, and both have shown very little success in their many years of fighting. So it's clear to me that the problem we're dealing with is not unique to democracies as such. In recent years, however, our public seem to be unhappy with what looks like a limited ability of our militaries to prevail over terror organizations. But I wonder if this frustration is justified. Let's review some of the crucial elements for winning such wars through the lens of Operation Defensive Shield that Israel launched in 2002 in order to destroy the infrastructure of the terror organizations who had been flushing the streets of Israel with suicide bombers those days. First, when we send our soldiers to fight, we have to believe that the war is absolutely needed to protect our homeland. In 2002, the public widely supported the operation, and this was crucial for its success. On the other hand, if soldiers fight without the support of the people back home, they will find it very hard to win a war. Then, if we don't know the exact objectives of the war, we will never know if we won it. The 2006 Lebanon War has been seen as a military failure when it ended because, among other things, the goals of the war were not clear, and thus it was also unclear whether they were achieved. On the other hand, the goals of the operation in 2002 were clear, both to the IDF and to the public, and it was easy to appreciate the success in achieving them. Also, military operations against terror organizations are challenging because these organizations are often decentralized and operate in small clandestine groups, and finding their weaknesses and centers of gravity is very hard. Julius Caesar is known to have said, "Veni, vidi, vici," I came, I saw, I conquered. And people want our militaries to do just that, rather than engage in endless wars. But reality is that defeating terror groups is a long-term effort and requires a lot of strategic patience and adaptation. Refusing to accept that will make winning the war impossible. On Operation Defensive Shield, both the IDF and the public have shown they are willing to endure a prolonged campaign in which the IDF had to adapt to circumstances it never encountered before. That was key to the operation's success. Lastly, armies of democracies have to fight with all the power they possess, but at the same time follow the laws of war, even when their enemies disregard these rules. We often hear the claim that wars can't be won in such an unfair imbalance. I strongly oppose this claim. Following the criteria set by international law is our strength, not a weakness. We all remember the horrors of World War II, in which civilians were targeted directly. We don't want to be a part of that. At the same time, we should also fight against efforts by various groups to distort the interpretation of the laws of war in a way that makes it almost impossible for law-abiding armies to win the war. That was never the intention of the intent of these laws. On the contrary, these laws were drafted in order to allow the military to win the war while mitigating civilian harm. The distortion of the concept of proportionality is especially egregious. Proportionality requires that collateral damage will not be excessive comparing to military gain. Terror groups choose to fight from within civilian surroundings. To win in such a setting will sometimes require using immense military power. As long as this power is needed to achieve significant military gains, proportional attacks may tragically cause significant civilian casualties. This will not be a violation of international law. On the other hand, unlawful acts, such as intentional killing of civilians or using human shields, may serve the purpose of terror groups, but do not promote the gains of a professional military. Therefore, the claim that destroying or disobeying international law will make winning the war easier is false. Here too, part of the 2002 operation's success was that the IDF has used immense military power to crush the terror groups while strictly obeying international law. During the fighting, our Supreme Court has heard dozens of cases regarding every legal aspect of the fighting. Operation Defensive Shield is one of the most successful military operations of our time and serves as a proof that democracies can defeat terror organizations. Terror groups are not only trying to kill us, they are also fighting our democratic freedoms and way of life. If we follow their example and defy the rules, we let terror win. If our commanders go back to their homes knowing they betrayed the values they were sent to fight or defend, we let terror win. If we interfere with the proper operation of all branches of our government at war, we let terror win again. And we cannot let terror win. The former Chief Justice of Israel's Supreme Court once wrote, "Although democracy must often fight with one hand tied behind its back, it nonetheless has the upper hand." We should all subscribe to this if we want to ensure that we win our wars against terror while remaining faithful to our values. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colonel Bar-On. That was masterfully timed. I hope that everybody will be as disciplined as you have just been. You've certainly set the bar very, very high indeed. But we've got the right individual to follow you, arguing in the negative to the question, can democracies win wars against terrorist organizations? We have the privilege now of introducing Professor Michel Paradis. Professor Paradis is a leading human rights lawyer and national security law scholar. He has won high-profile cases around the globe, including some of the landmark cases to arise out of Guantanamo Bay for the U.S. Department of Defense Military Commission Defense Organization. He is a lecturer at Columbia Law School, where he teaches courses on national security law, international law, and the Constitution, and he is a fellow at the Center on National Security. Most recently, he has authored the best-selling book, Last Mission to Tokyo, about war crimes trials in the Pacific after World War II. He was awarded his doctorate from Oxford University, where he was a Kempian scholar, and received his law degree from Fordham Law School in New York. He lives in New York with his wife and children. Now, Professor Paradis, before you take to the floor, let me ask you this candidly, between us, we won't tell anyone. You're currently a lecturer at Columbia Law School, and prior to that, you were a lecturer at Georgetown University Law Center. They're both excellent, but I know that your doctorate is from Oxford University. Tell us the truth. Is it not the case that Great Britain has the finest seats of academia anywhere in the world, Professor?
I'm in America right now, and so I will take the Fifth Amendment and therefore not incriminate myself.
Well, there you go, Professor. The floor is yours. You have 7 minutes.
Thank you very much. And let me start by saying that I agree with almost everything that Colonel Bar-On said, particularly about the need of democracies to fight with their values and to lead with their values, because that is ultimately what separates them from their enemies. But the question is not whether or not a terrorist organization can be momentarily defeated. It's whether or not democracies can win a war against a terrorist organization. And that can't be done for the simple reason that terrorist organizations cannot surrender. If a terrorist organization is defeated in battle, with whom do you negotiate the terms of peace? Can you trust those terms of peace? You can't, because at the end of the day, a terrorist organization is not an adversary in a traditional armed conflict. They're criminal organizations. And as criminal organizations, the best way to deal with them is through the means of the criminal law. Now, does that mean you can't use military force when necessary? Absolutely not. We use the military to support law enforcement operations almost every day of the week. Every time drugs are interdicted when coming into the country, the military is used in support of law enforcement operations. But the difference is the legal regime that you use. When you use law enforcement, you use a human rights legal regime. Now, that may sound soft to some, but I would pose that the human rights legal regime doesn't offer constraints on the use of force, on the ability to deal with terrorist violence that are any more significant in practice than the laws of armed conflict, which a democracy must comply with in order to maintain its status as a liberal democracy. And as Colonel Bar-On said, I think it's important that democracies preserve their values in the context of these armed conflicts, if only because not being a democracy doesn't make you any better at defeating your adversaries. Quite the contrary. When the Soviet Union fought in Afghanistan, they lost. When Saudi Arabia has attempted to fight in Yemen, they're losing. And so being a democracy, being a totalitarian state, being a monarchy, doesn't make you any less or more equipped to win against a terrorist organization, because you cannot win a war against an adversary with whom you are unwilling or unable to negotiate. Because at the end of the day, that terrorist organization, you may kill its leader, as we did with Osama bin Laden, but that organization will splinter, it will metastasize, and you'll be fighting a hydra for a generation to come. Now, the second reason you can't win a war against a terrorist organization, and you shouldn't even try, Colonel Bar-On cited the eminent Israeli jurist Aaron Barak. I would cite the great American philosopher Mark Twain, and that is, you shouldn't wrestle with a pig, because in the process, you're going to get dirty and the pig's going to like it. And when you wrestle with a pig, when you go to war with a terrorist organization, you're giving that terrorist organization precisely what it wants. It wants to legitimize its violence and to make the debate that you are having with it a political debate about ideology, about outcomes, about worldviews. And when you engage in a war, you are saying that the adversary is able to fight back, that violence is the only and the primary means by which we can actually engage, by which we can engage in this armed conflict. And when you do that, you're giving terrorist organizations the thing they want most, which is legitimacy, which is a cause, which is a struggle with which to organize their supporters and to fight against what they deem often to be an evil empire on equal terms. And I don't have to give you a lot of examples to illustrate this point clearly. For example, in the military tribunals in Guantanamo, there was an extensive litigated debate about whether or not the alleged perpetrators of the September 11th attack, a murder here in New York City that took the lives of 3,000 people, whether or not they, because they were being tried in a military commission, because the premise of the charges against them was that they were accused of war crimes and they were enemy combatants in a war, that they could appear in court not in a suit and tie, not in a prison jumpsuit, but in camouflage. And ultimately, the judge said, yes, you get the right to wear camouflage in court, which is precisely what the perpetrators of the September 11th attacks wanted. They wanted to be recognized as combatants in a war. That's precisely what Osama bin Laden said he wanted to do, was to entice the United States into a war footing, to put a terrorist organization such as Al-Qaeda in a peer status with the United States. There's finally one other reason why you should never attempt to fight a war against a terrorist organization, or for that matter, that you cannot win it. And that is the nature of democracy. Democracies, in today's climate, democracies are subject to public pressure, to public influence, to public opinion. And that's a good thing. We don't want countries like the United States to reduce themselves to the level of countries whose values we do not share, values of human rights, values of equality, values of individual human dignity. We want our governments to act accountably. And the simple fact is that a democracy where you're electing your leaders on essentially a 2-year basis, 4 years with respect to the president, but in the United States, the Congress is elected every 2 years. In countries like Great Britain and in Israel, the democratic process is much more vulnerable because you have the ability to have snap elections. That when you have a governmental system that is based upon a 2-year cycle, and you're dealing with a terrorist organization that has a vision of its conflict that will last a generation, inevitably the terrorist organization is fighting with a significant advantage that will ensure in the long term that it wins. Because every 2 years, there's going to be a debate about strategy, about what my friend on the other side, Colonel Bar-On, said, the goals. Democracies are not patient. They're not patient institutions. Terrorist organizations are. And so when you are attempting to fight on equal terms, when you're fighting in terms of moral equality with a terrorist organization, then inevitably the advantage goes to the terrorist organization and ensures that the democracy can never win. But what democracies can do is use the incredible powers of law enforcement. That includes surveillance, that includes, when necessary, military support. Such methods were successful in defeating the Irish Republican Army in the United Kingdom. They were successful in defeating various terrorist organizations inside the United States, such as the Weather Underground, which throughout the 1970s perpetrated 4 times the number of terrorist attacks that we endure today. And it's through the use of law enforcement tools, it's through the use of the human rights paradigm that we can uphold not only our values, but that we can also win in defeating terrorist organizations who are, at the end of the day, simply criminal organizations with a political ideology.
Thank you very much, Professor Paradis. We very much appreciate your argumentation. And I'm now going to move on to, again, arguing in the affirmative for the question, can democracies win wars against terrorist organizations? Professor Alan Dershowitz. But before I read just some of the highlights and achievements from his career, I want to steer everyone towards his podcast called The Der Show, which I assume everybody can download wherever they download a podcast. I myself watch it regularly on YouTube, incidentally. And I would encourage all of you to familiarize yourselves with that show, where he really does tackle hot button issues of the day, pertinent to us all. Also, please be sure to read his new book, Guilt by Accusation, The Challenge of Proving Innocence in the Age of Me Too. That book is not only available in English, but it will soon be published in Hebrew as well. Please also read Defending Israel, the story of my relationship with my most challenging client. This book describes Professor Dershowitz's encounters with Israel's prime ministers, America's presidents, and Israel's critics over half a century. You all know him. He is the Felix Frankfurter Professor of Law at Harvard Law School. Dershowitz is a graduate of Brooklyn College and Yale Law School. He joined the Harvard Law School faculty at the age of 25 after clerking for Judge David Bezalon and Justice Arthur Goldberg. Now, before I ask you to take the floor, Professor Dershowitz, this debate is all about the ability of democracies to win wars against terrorist organizations. Now, on the topic of democracies, I'd like you to tell our audience about that incredible conversation you've recounted at least once to me that you had with President Bill Clinton about how he described the troublesome nature of Israel as a democratic state in the context of peacemaking. Tell us about that, if you would.
Well, he said to me, Israel's big problem is that it's a democracy, damn it. He said, a democracy, damn it. He said, when I want the Jordanians to do something, it's very easy. I call up the king and he does it. When I want Egypt to do something, I call up the president. He does it. When I call the prime minister of Israel, he says, let me check with my big cabinet, with my security cabinet. Let me do some polls. Let's see what the people think. Let me read Haaretz. Let me call this organization. He says, you can't get Israel to do anything because it's a democracy. Damn it. And that was before we had elections every 3 or 4 months.
There you go. It's high on democracy, as we heard in one of our recent podcasts. Well, Professor Dershowitz, we're very pleased to have you. We're honored to have you, and we're delighted to ask you to make your argumentation. Your 7 minutes begins right now.
It's a great honor for me to be among such a distinguished panel. When I look around at the panel, I think this is the greatest collection of wisdom about the law of war and terrorism since Clausewitz sat alone in his study. It's really an honor to be here. I think it's important that we focus on the words of the debate to begin with. The words are not will democracy win wars, it's can democracy win wars. And wars, we have to understand, when we talk about wars, we don't exclude law enforcement. We don't exclude other aspects. We talk about wars as something that is a combination of factors. Again, to quote Clausewitz, war is a continuation of politics by other means. And so I do think that democracies can win. Whether they can win by wars alone, I mean, that's a debatable question. I have a book called Why Terrorism Works, and I have a chapter in the book on how democracies could win but it means really violating many of the principles, violating Aaron Barak's notion of one hand tied behind their backs. But the thesis of my book and the thesis of my presentation today is that the reason terrorism continues and the reason terrorism works is that it is rewarded, not punished. Terrorism works. Terrorism is rewarded. Terrorism is accepted. Virtually every country in the world and every international institution says they reject terrorism and they don't reward terrorism. But when there's a conflict between their own national interests and the international interests in deterring and preventing terrorism, virtually every country gives in to terrorists. Great Britain freed terrorists. France freed terrorists. Germany freed the horrible terrorists at the Olympics. Italy has freed terrorists. And the United Nations has equated terrorist gangs and terrorist countries with democracies. Just last week, the International Criminal Court encouraged terrorism by equating Hamas, which is a terrorist organization, with Israel, saying it would open up an investigation equally as to both Israel, which obviously under principles of complementarity clearly have a system to deal with any abuses in wartime, whereas Hamas doesn't even pretend to have a system. But when we continue to reward terrorism, obviously we will lose. We will continue to lose. Look, terrorists are willing to die. Terrorists are willing to be killed. Terrorists are willing to suffer. Terrorists are even sometimes willing to have their families suffer. We see that in Israel, terrorists continue to terrorize, even though they know their family homes will be destroyed. Sure, the Palestinians have a pay-for-slay policy to helping rebuild them, but terrorists will do anything, sacrifice anything, with one exception. Terrorists will never sacrifice their cause. And if we establish an international commitment, a universal international commitment, that every time there's a terrorist act, every time, no exceptions, that terrorist cause will be set back, will lose. If we can persuade terrorists that their actions are going to be counterproductive, they will stop engaging in terrorism. Can we do that? Of course we can do it. Will we do it? Well, countries don't have morality. They have self-interest. And when countries say, look, we'll compromise, we'll negotiate with terrorism, we'll exchange terrorists for help, for a guarantee they won't attack us, which is what France did and what Italy did, and implicitly what other countries have done, we're going to continue to lose. So, yes, I think we can win. I certainly reject, with all due respect, Professor Paradis' notion, quote, and I'll quote him, we shouldn't even try to win wars against terrorism. No, we should try, but we shouldn't try to use military action by itself. We should follow Clausewitz's very important dictum that war is part of a more general policy. We should use warfare to attack, to weaken, to, yes, target for assassination leaders who are planning terrorist attacks. We should do what we can on the military field to set them back, and see that as part and parcel of a larger attack, a diplomatic attack, an economic attack, but most important of all, a moral commitment, a universal moral commitment by every country in the world, and by the United Nations, and by the International Criminal Court, and by the International Court of Justice, that they will never reward terrorism, and they will always punish terrorism, always set terrorism back. If we could get that message across, we will win. We will not win because we will defeat them alone on the battlefield. We will win because they will surrender. They will seek other means that will further their objective, and they will abandon means that will set back their objective. So the goal is, every time there's a terrorist attack, it must set back the cause of the terrorism. And when you get the United Nations and the International Criminal Court declaring Palestine to be a state without borders, a state without elections, a state without central authority. But when they declare them to be a state, what they do is they say terrorism worked. It succeeded. It really, really pays to be a terrorist. You will win if you engage in terrorism. The message has to be, you will lose when you engage in terrorism. We can do it if we have the will to do it. Will we do it? I'm not optimistic about that. But, you know, in Israel, they say a pessimist is somebody who says things are so terrible they can't get worse. An optimist says, yes, they can. I think they can both get worse and they can get better if we're determined to make terrorism lose.
Thank you so very much, Professor Dershowitz. That was, again, beautifully timed and well landed. And I'm very, very pleased to introduce our final debater, Colonel Richard Kemp. Colonel Richard Kemp, retired, has spent most of his life fighting terrorism and insurgency, commanding British troops on the front line of some of the world's toughest hotspots, including Afghanistan, Iraq, the Balkans, and Northern Ireland. He's now a writer, a prolific journalist, media commentator, and lecturer. And I can speak very, very highly indeed of his book, Attack State Red, which I encourage everybody to go out and purchase. He provides strategic consultancy services on leadership, security, intelligence, counterterrorism, and defense. Richard was sent to Kabul in 2003 to take command of British forces in Afghanistan. He was the commander of British forces in Afghanistan, indeed. He joined the British Army the day after he left high school and spent the next 30 years in some of the world's most notorious trouble spots. In 1993, he was appointed member of the Order of the British Empire by the Queen for intelligence work in Northern Ireland. He took part in the invasion of Iraq in 1991 in a Challenger tank with the Desert Rats and was decorated for bravery with the United Nations Protection Force in Bosnia in 1994. He was also a member of COBRA, the government's top-level crisis management committee. He chaired the COBRA intelligence group responsible for coordinating the work of the national intelligence agencies, including MI5 and MI6, during the July 2005 London bombings, the Madrid and Bali attacks, and a number of high-profile political kidnappings. He was appointed commander of the Order of the British Empire for his work, and in the words of the Chief of Defense of Intelligence, had a huge influence at the highest level of government. Now, Richard, before I ask you to bring this home with your 7 minutes of argumentation, I want to ask you one question. Who is the greatest Briton with American heritage? Is it Winston Churchill, Richard, or Meghan Markle?
Well, Meghan Markle is not, as far as I know, is not a Briton, but she's certainly an American, and she's now set up the rival court in Los Angeles. So I think I would probably put my money on Winston Churchill as being not only the greatest Briton with American heritage, but probably also the greatest Briton that's ever lived. And before I do let you allow me to speak on the subject, I would like to say how honored I am to be present in a MirYam Institute debate. I have huge respect for your institute, and in particular, I've considered it a great privilege to be present tonight with such a incredibly distinguished panel of other people who I cannot disagree with what they've said, or I can't disagree with anything they've said in the past. And I'm slightly surprised to find myself on the opposite side, for example, of Professor Dershowitz in this argument. But thank you anyway.
Thank you. And after those effusive thank yous, you have about 12 seconds left, Richard. So make it snappy. But in all seriousness, Richard, we're delighted to have you here. It really is a pleasure. And as your namesake is said to have said in the eponymous Shakespearean play, let's to it pell-mell. Your 7 minutes start right now.
Well, thank you. For a democracy to win a war against terrorism, the government must be satisfied that the majority of the electorate support the war. Otherwise, they risk being voted out at the next election. If that is the case, they will wage war with that in mind and won't win. Look at President Obama's decision to withdraw all US troops from Iraq before the 2012 election, which led directly to the rise of ISIS. Today, President Macron is intent on drawing down French forces in Mali, by 2022, not because the job will be done then, but because that is an election year. Democratic support for a war can be achieved in three ways. First, the electorate understand they personally risk being killed or injured or losing their freedom and livelihood. In other words, the threat is existential. Wars against terrorism cannot be judged in this way. Second, the electorate is educated into supporting a war by information and persuasion. That requires support from the media. The media itself must be open and fair in order for the government's case to be presented. If the majority of the media is set against the government's cause and working to its own agenda, this cannot happen. Most media, especially broadcast media, in most democratic countries are biased in a way that are unlikely to support a war that is not existential. We've seen how that constrains military action in any such conflict. For example, Western governments in Iraq and Afghanistan were unable to openly communicate the cause for which they were fighting, repeatedly changing their purpose, wavering between preventing WMD use, defeating terrorists, reconstruction, establishing democracy, promoting human rights, and negotiating a settlement. Third, a common and strong morality and commitment, usually religious or sense of purpose, usually patriotism, that is held by the majority sufficiently strongly for them to believe that war is a justifiable means to the perceived end. This existed in the West until the mid-20th century. Today, all three factors I mentioned have been eroded and weakened by moral relativism to the point where now it is very unlikely that any war other than existential war would have majority backing. If democratic support for a war is in fact achieved, despite all that, the government must be certain that support can be maintained until the war is won. Two main factors have to be considered here. First, the endurance of the population when confronted by casualties among the forces and the high costs involved. Endurance is a product of strength of character, individual toughness, and belief. Modern standards are different, for example, from what was common in the Second World War. It's unlikely that a modern democracy will support a non-existential war for very long. Second, the extent and severity of the war needed to win and whether the population will accept it. This depends on the type of terrorist war being fought. Restrained terrorism is limited by social, political, moral, or religious constraints. The IRA, ETA, and Baader-Meinhof, for example, fit this category. As the terrorist is constrained in his actions, so the response can be restrained. Such restrained military action can be more easily justified and sustained. Britain eventually defeated the IRA with limited action, although even some of the tactics used then are unlikely to be used today, with some of the soldiers involved being pursued through the legal system half a century later. It is possible that such a war could still be won, but that is not the main terrorist threat facing democracies today. That threat comes from unrestrained fundamentalist terrorism. The terrorist has total dedication to the cause and no constraints. Such force can only be beaten with even greater force. So a democracy which chooses to fight such a war must be prepared to do whatever it takes to win within the law of war. In recent conflicts, fearful of domestic and international criticism, the US, UK, and their Western allies imposed overly restrictive rules of engagement on their forces, well beyond the requirements of the laws of war. Over-application of the laws of war was combined in Iraq and Afghanistan with overemphasis on winning hearts and minds of the civilian population, even at the expense of allowing terrorists to escape unscathed. The order of the day became courageous restraint, but the populations in those countries had no respect for courageous restraint, only for strength. Osama bin Laden himself said, "When people see a strong horse and a weak horse, they prefer the strong horse." Most people believed the most ruthless would prevail, and it would be the worse for them if they were on the other side. Paradoxically, measures intended to gain support from the population, in fact, often had the opposite effect, making it even more difficult for the perceived weak horse to win the war. The US Army counterinsurgency manual says, "The more force you use, the less effective it is." In the most successful counterinsurgency campaign in recent years, the opposite approach enabled the Sri Lankan government to defeat the Tamil Tigers. Their strategy switched from a negotiated settlement to the total annihilation of the terrorists. With less concern for civilian casualties or protecting the civilian population, they used military force bluntly and brutally. Sri Lanka's policy was heavily criticized by Western democracies, which withdrew aid on humanitarian grounds. True democracies like Israel are also subject to similar intensive criticism from other democracies and international institutions when they have to resort to concerted military force against terrorists. And this has encumbered their efforts to deal decisively with constant violence from Palestinian terrorists. Having spent most of my life fighting terrorists, I would like to be able to speak on the other side of this debate, but my experience and my observations show me that despite having all the capabilities to defeat terrorist organizations, today Western democracy lack the vital ingredient, the political and moral will to pay the price of victory.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Colonel Kemp. And we very much appreciate your argumentation. And of course, we learn by way of it. Now, ladies and gentlemen, having heard all four of our debaters, we're going to turn to our moderators. And we've got a wonderful lineup of experienced and relevant moderators for you this evening. Our first moderator is Mr. Eric Axdorf, who will pose a question, and I will then bounce that question around the horn of debaters. I'd like to ask Alan Langer to please bring up Eric Axdorf so that he can pose his question. Eric, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Benjamin, and thank you for having me. And my question for the panel is, for democracies in the fight against terrorism, where do you think the immediate or closest point of interjection is where we can make a difference? Where should we cut our losses and start over? In the event that you have the full weight of, say, the United States House of Representatives, the United States Senate, and the presidency, or with the British or Israeli equivalent, all on the same page, what would your immediate focus be in terms of policy implementation for fighting the war on terrorism?
Thank you very much for that question, Eric, and thank you for your tremendous service to your country. I'd like to take that, first of all, to the panel arguing in the affirmative, and I'd like to pitch it, please, to Professor Dershowitz. Would you please deal with that? After that, I'm going to take it to the panel arguing in the negative, and then I will move it around. We will alternate between the respondents. So, Professor Dershowitz, if you could go first.
Well, first of all, I completely agree with Colonel Kemp that we lack the political and moral will to fight terrorism the way we ought to. That doesn't mean we can't do it. We have to focus on developing the moral and political will to do that. And I also think, to answer the question that's been put, we have to distinguish between three very different types of terrorism. Purely domestic terrorism, Professor Paradis is right. When you have a purely domestic organization like the Weathermen, of course you fight them by law enforcement. But then there are two other forms of terrorism: regional terrorism, that is Hamas and Hezbollah, or some of the other regional terrorists. And they are state-sponsored in many ways, and they have to be fought by a combination of military on the external part of it and law enforcement on the internal part. And then third, there's international terrorism like ISIS, and they have to be fought almost exclusively militarily. So there's no one simple answer. And I think the way we have to focus is to make sure we have a multifaceted approach to multifaceted terrorism. But the one uniting factor must be no terrorist act shall ever be rewarded, and every terrorist act shall always result in a setback for the cause of the terrorists.
Thank you very much. Professor Paradis, would you like to take that question?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I would love to live in a world in which no terrorist act went unpunished and unvilified. But we do live with the unfortunate moral relevancy, as my colleague Colonel Kemp said, of one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. That's a expression that goes back time immemorial, and it represents a basic truth that when it comes to international politics, getting a diverse range of countries to focus on and to say that one particular organization is unquestionably a terrorist organization is incredibly difficult. I can think of a few: ISIS, Al Qaeda, and so the idea that international consensus will drive this, I just don't think is frankly realistic. And therefore, we have to look at what is realistic. And ultimately, the law enforcement paradigm, I think, is far more effective and realistic in dealing with terrorism. And I'll give you a couple of international terrorism examples. Since September 11th, there have been approximately 700 cases brought in the federal courts involving international terrorism, including material support and any number of extremely broad offenses that allow the Justice Department to pursue individuals who support, seek to join, have participated with or received military training or given funding to terrorist organizations. And in about 99% of those cases, there have been convictions with an average sentence of about 17 to 18 years. That is just more effective than the kind of things we've attempted to do, for example, in Guantanamo or even Afghanistan, where our conduct very often can blow back. And that blowback is something that we have to take into account because we are a democracy. And so using the tools of law enforcement gives us the ability to, one, judge criminal violence as criminal violence for what it is, and not to have to engage with sort of rococo political debates about ideology. And it allows us to make a clear moral distinction between ourselves and our terrorist enemies, to say that you are criminals, you are a gang, you are no better than the drug dealers that we send to prison every day, and we'll treat you as such. And that's a moral equivalence that respects our principles, sets an example for people who may be on the fence, and delegitimizes and deprives terrorist organizations of the banner that they can fly once we declare a war on terrorism.
Thank you very much, Professor. We're going to move on to our next moderator, and I'd like to please bring in Salam Kako. Could Salam please come and ask the question? We're very honored to have you with us. Please introduce yourself, and the floor is yours.
Good evening, gentlemen. My name is Salam Kako, and I'm an active duty surface warfare officer in the U.S. Navy. I've deployed to the Gulf in support of Operation Inherent Resolve, combating ISIS in Iraq and Syria, and I have 4 deployments in the Pacific. For my question, we went into Iraq with an idea of liberating the Iraqi people. Today, Iraq is politically broken, religiously divided, economically fraught, and some feel that they were better off under Saddam. My question is, did we create instability in the region by empowering Iran with the removal of Saddam? Can you frame your response in the context of the debate question? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to actually pitch that one to you, Colonel Richard Kemp, for the first response to Salam's question.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing I would say is I don't believe we had a choice other than to go into Iraq when we did. And I know it's not necessarily the most popular opinion in the world, but I do believe it to be the case. And I was at that time when the decision was taken, I was working within the British government, dealing with international terrorism myself, and was well aware of many of the arguments that were discussed. And I think that we look at it differently through the prism of today, but back then, immediately after 9/11, it was a very different situation. And I think the greatest fear of governments in the US and the UK and elsewhere was that this terrorist organization, Al-Qaeda, which had shown itself to be totally and utterly unrestrained, killing thousands of people on one day in the United States. The real fear was that they would become linked up with a state, and that state, the state of greatest concern at that time, was Iraq. And therefore, I don't believe that there was much choice apart from to go and take down Saddam Hussein, who certainly had links with Al-Qaeda. They may not have been very strong links, but there were links, and a fear that those links would grow. So I don't think it was something that we chose to do. It obviously was a choice, but I don't think it was much of a choice. I think we really had to engage in that war. How it was conducted afterwards is a different story entirely. And I just don't want to go to that in the context of your question, Salam, but I do believe that we have, some of the actions we've taken have led Iran to go onto the offensive. And in some ways, it did enable Iran to establish itself in the position it is today, where it is a very dominant force in Iraq. And I think that was partly due, not necessarily entirely due, but partly due to President Obama's decision in 2011 to withdraw all US forces from Iraq, which opened up a vacuum both for Islamic State to be created, but also for Iran to get a stronger foothold there. I think, there's obviously many other factors involved in Iran's aggression across the region and indeed across the world today. And those include enabling Iran to have sanctions relief and to have vast amounts of money available to it to prosecute a far wider spread war than it had been doing up to then. So I think I would say, yeah, if events had happened differently at the time of the invasion of Iraq in 2003, we might not have been where we are today. We might have been in a worse position. But I think there were some decisions taken since 2003, since that invasion occurred, which has led to the situation that we're in today, and which does need to be, I believe, to be fought tooth and nail against Iran.
Thank you very much, Colonel Kemp. From one colonel to the other, Colonel Eli Bar-On, could you please weigh in on that? And also, though the question was framed in the context of Iraq, feel free to bring an Israeli example to your response.
Thank you. So thank you for your question, Salam, and thank you for your service. I totally agree with Richard that in a way your question has the privilege in a way that of a hindsight, okay? And people who started the war in Iraq in 2003 did not necessarily know what will be the prognosis of all the outcomes of the war. I think it was very clear to them that they are trying to deal with weapons of mass destruction. I doubt any Iraqi, except maybe former members of the Ba'ath Party, is willing to go back to Saddam Hussein's days. He was most definitely one of the most sinister tyrants the world has ever known. Iraq is much better off without him, that's for sure. But there is an issue of how do you win the peace in these countries? Okay, so America most definitely won the war, toppled Saddam, prevailed over his military, but has not won or entirely won the peace. Okay, if we look at what happened at World War II, America has won the peace in Germany and Japan. There was an immense work on nation building. These are two of the most developed democracies in the world today, Germany and Japan, industrial countries, huge powers. So why doesn't it happen why didn't it happen in Iraq or in Afghanistan for that matter? I think the fact that these efforts take such a long time, and as Richard also said before, the public in our countries has no patience for going through such long processes is part of the problem. If we look at what's Benjamin asked for an Israeli example, people were in a way disappointed of the results of the 2014 Gaza campaign. Why? Because some people said enough is enough. Hamas has been launching rockets towards us for 20 years now, and we should put an end to that. We should go inside Gaza, go from one house to another, arrest or kill any Hamas militant we can find, and take over the place until there is no more terrorism emanating from that place. But the question is, can we really sustain such a long effort? This will take years. The price will be heavy, both in terms of casualties and in terms of the funds to pay for this campaign. And most certainly the same public that will support such an effort at the beginning of the campaign will lose patience after 2 months at the most.
Thank you.
So it's the same problem in a way.
Thank you very much, Colonel Bar-On. We're going to now move to our third moderator, and that is Cade Spivey. Cade, we're delighted to have you with us. Please, if you could pose your question to our debaters.
We've poked at an issue throughout this debate, and I would like to confront it a little bit more directly. Freedom of speech and belief is a feature of modern democracy. So how can democracies confront terrorist acts without also directly confronting any motivating terrorist ideologies? And to what extent should we be willing to sacrifice some of our liberal principles like freedom of speech in the name of safety and security? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Cade. And I'm going to take that, please, first to Professor Paradis, if you can take that on. In the frame of your argument, you're arguing in the negative that indeed democracies cannot win wars against terrorist organizations. Professor Paradis, and I'm going to ask for responses to be limited to 2 minutes, please.
Sure, thank you, and excellent question, and thank you very much for it. I would say you should never look at the false equivalence of trading our civil liberties for security. Benjamin Franklin, another great American philosopher, up there with Mark Twain, said anyone who trade liberty for security will ultimately find that they have neither. And I do think it's ultimately a false choice. You can fight terrorist organizations and their ideologies with your own ideology, with the better of the arguments. And you can use law enforcement as a way of showing that terrorist violence is fundamentally illegitimate, because it's not terrorist ideologies that we have to be worried about. It's not. It's terrorist violence. There are all sorts of people who believe all sorts of strange things and dangerous things. The spaghetti monster in the sky is going to terrorize all of us. What we have to be worried about is terrorist violence that disrupts our way of life. The most effective way of dealing with that is dealing with the violence, seeking it out at its root, and using whatever means available to us to delegitimize it. And I'll give you an example from the Israeli context. Marwan Barghouti, the leader of the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade during the first Intifada, did the Israeli government capture him as a prisoner of war? No, it didn't. It arrested him, put him on trial, and it put first and foremost in that trial the suffering of his victims. It didn't give him that trial as an opportunity for grandstanding and to argue a political platform. It said, you claim to be a prisoner of war. Well, if you're claiming the rights and laws of war in your favor, you have violated those laws of war by attacking civilians, most basic premise of the law of war. And it used the ordinary criminal justice system in Israel to prosecute him, to sentence him as a murderer, where he is now serving out that sentence in an Israeli prison as a murderer.
Thank you very much indeed. Professor Dershowitz, this is a very important question. This quandary of balancing democratic principles or principles of democratic states with the war against terror, can you pass that out? And indeed, can it be struck in a way, as you're arguing in the affirmative, that would enable democratic states to win wars against terrorist organizations?
Well, with all due respect, I have devoted my life to civil liberties and free speech, but I fundamentally disagree with the notion that there is no trade-off between civil liberties and security. Benjamin Franklin was wrong. I think Aaron Barak may have overstated it, and I think Professor Paradis overstates it. We do give up a little bit of liberty in the interests of security. We, however, often disguise it. For example, in law enforcement, yes, Barghouti was arrested, but he was tried with tremendous compromises to civil liberties. I would not call his trial a paradigm of democratic due process. The same thing is true when we treated as law enforcement issue the Nazis who came ashore during the Second World War. Yes, we treated them as a law enforcement problem. We put them on trial, but the trial was a kangaroo court. So there are always going to be compromises. There is no free lunch. And I hope we try our best to keep the compromises to a minimum. It's long been said that the first casualty of war is often civil liberties, and that's true. And that's why we should always be reluctant to go to war. But the first casualty of overuse of law enforcement in order to get a 99% conviction rate, which is what Professor Paradis kind of boasted about, as a criminal defense lawyer, you don't get 99% conviction rates generally without some compromise of due process, of the right to counsel, of exclusionary rules, of other kinds of things. We're all tempted to use law enforcement, but when we compromise law enforcement, we do actually more damage. It was the great Justice Jackson who said when the liberal president of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, locked up 110,000 Americans in Japanese detention centers as a law enforcement measure. It was Justice Jackson who said, if that were done by the military, that would just be an incident. But when the Supreme Court affirmed it and said it was legitimate, that turned it into a loaded weapon lying around to be used by any tyrant. So although the line between law enforcement and war is often not a clear line, I think we have to try to keep it as separate as possible. And just to repeat my final point, fighting terrorism requires law enforcement, diplomacy, economics, politics, and war. And I think without war, we cannot defeat regional and international terrorists. We might be able to defeat domestic terrorists.
Thank you very much, Professor Dershowitz. And for our last question from our moderator, we call on Daniel Calby. Daniel, could you please ask the question of our debaters? You are our final moderator for this evening. And right after their responses, we'll be moving to their summary arguments.
Thank you, Benjamin. Good evening, gentlemen. Thank you for taking the time to be on tonight's panel. Based on my experience, I believe the attempted democratization of unstable regions via military intervention in the Middle East and Central Asia may not be the most effective means to rid these regions of terrorism. For example, if we negotiate with and cede control of Afghanistan back to the Taliban after 20 years of warfare, has our goal of democratizing this nation been achieved? And what will be done in the future to ensure that the country does not become a haven for terror?
Thank you very much, Daniel. Colonel Kemp, that one is to you first and foremost, please.
Right. I don't think there will be a negotiated settlement with the Taliban. There might appear to be one on paper potentially, but I can't see any settlement being arrived at that would be that would in any way conform with our requirements or indeed the requirements of the government of Afghanistan. So I don't think that that's likely to actually occur. I don't believe also that our goal in going into Afghanistan was to bring democracy to Afghanistan. I believe, and this is one of the problems with democratic countries fighting this kind of war, they couldn't agree really on what they wanted to be doing there, and they wouldn't be open and honest, I don't believe, about the real objective, which was to annihilate al-Qaeda and to take the Taliban out to the extent that Afghanistan could no longer be used as a safe haven from which to attack the West as it had been on 9/11. That was the objective. To an extent, that has been achieved throughout that campaign because a similar attack hasn't come out of Afghanistan. But I do believe if we did withdraw, with or without any kind of agreement, then the country would be open yet again to the ravages of al-Qaeda, who have never lost their relationship with the Taliban, the Islamic State, whose presence is growing in Afghanistan. And I think that while I don't support maintaining a long-term large military presence in the country any longer, I do believe that there are means by which we could limit their offensive capability, which involves predominantly using special forces intelligence elements and also airstrikes against them. I think those are pretty much, plus of course, continuing to provide whatever support we can to give the Afghanistan government greater resilience and greater capability of dealing with the problem themselves.
Thank you very much, Colonel Kemp. Colonel Bar-On, can you please respond to that question? And again, if you'd like, in the 2 minutes that you have, to add an Israeli dimension, because there are obvious parallels, we'd welcome that too.
Yes. First of all, I totally agree with everything Richard said about Afghanistan. I don't think there was, in the first place, a real chance of bringing 100% democracy to this country. Democracy doesn't just grow like a tree. You need to have a culture of democracy. You need to have a long-term education of the population, and this population never had that. You look at the 1979 to 1989 war the Soviets had over there. It failed because of the population there is very tenacious, very combat ready, if you will, and was never looking for democracy. In the Israeli context, I would say that if we look at the Palestinian society, in many ways, the fact that they have been living side by side alongside Israel for so many years, there are many good signs that the Palestinian public is more ready for democracies than many other Arab publics in the area. The fact that they had access to Israeli courts throughout the years, had discourse with Israelis, have been working with Israelis, and have been exposed to Israeli media for so many years, I think in many ways made them much more open for having a democracy of their own. And in internal Palestinian discourse, even though they don't have the right elections and everything, you can see that at least many of the people would like to see themselves operating or the government operating as a democracy.
Thank you very much, Colonel Bar-On, and thank you to all of our moderators. We're now going to move to the 2-minute summary statement of each of our debaters. And I'm actually going to flip the script. No, I did not ask for permission before doing so, but I'm going to turn the order on its head. And I'm going to ask, please, Professor Michel Paradis to please begin with his 2-minute argumentation. And 30 seconds before the end, you will hear the chink of the glass. Michel Paradis, please, your summary statement begins now.
So let me actually start where everyone else began, and just to thank you and to thank the MirYam Institute and everyone involved, including my co-panelists, for what I hope was for me an incredibly interesting and exciting discussion, and I hope was for everyone who's participated and watched. It's really been a pleasure. And I would return to the question presented. Can democracies win wars against terrorist organizations? And I think the answer has to be no. And the answer is not no because the answer is no, not because I want it to be no. It would be lovely if democracies could win wars against terrorist organizations. But the simple fact is that they can't. The restraints that democracies that give democracies strength, such as public accountability, make it impossible to pursue wars of annihilation as Genghis Khan might have done 1,000 years ago. The nature of terrorist organizations means that you have no one with whom you can negotiate, and therefore no one who can surrender, and therefore no way of knowing whether or not you've been victorious. Because if you defeat one terrorist organization, inevitably they're going to splinter off and become another terrorist organization. And so you're leading yourself to an era of perpetual war, which I would say we've been in for the past 20 years. And lastly, on the civil liberties point, because I think this is crucial to the question of democracies. It's a question of what kind of society we want to live in. And is that when we embrace the war paradigm, we are not only giving the terrorist organization precisely what it wants, we are compromising our values in a broad-based way. We're creating the pretext by which to sacrifice civil liberties. Civil liberties are the most vulnerable in wartime. It was the army that interned the Japanese during World War II. It was the army that prosecuted the German saboteurs in a summary military commission in 1942. And that's not to say that the military can't do and has done many, many wonderful things. But when it comes to defeating terrorist organizations, law enforcement is the best way to go.
Thank you very much, Professor Paradis. We appreciate your final 2 minutes. And we're going to move now to Colonel Eli Bar-On. Eli Bar-On, please, if you could make your final 2-minute statement arguing in the affirmative, answering the question, can democracies win war against terrorist organizations? You have 2 minutes beginning now.
Thank you. I would like to thank my co-debaters for a wonderful debate and you, Benjamin, for excellent moderating. I don't think that, while I agree that with Michel that law enforcement may be suitable for some instances in which we deal with terrorism, and we certainly have that in Israel, it does not suit the fights, the conflicts that we have with Hamas and Hezbollah. We don't have any ability of arresting these people, bringing them into Israel for trial, and this is irrelevant. In my opinion, questioning our ability to win wars against terrorists is a vote of no confidence for democracies. Of course, we can win these wars. And since Churchill was mentioned, we all remember him saying that democracy is the worst form of government except all others. Now, as long as we believe that our democracy is the best government to reflect our values, we just simply cannot accept the claim that we cannot prevail over terror. Okay, this will be unacceptable, just as much as saying that communist China has a better form of government than ours because it could use extreme undemocratic tools to deal with the pandemic. So we should not accept such thoughts and endanger our democracy. History is written by the victors, and we should not allow terror groups to write our history. If we accept that, we must also accept that in order to be victorious, even liberal democracies sometimes have to resort to power and use their militaries very decisively. It's okay to feel bad about it, as long as we know that we have to do it in order to preserve our way of life and win. And on our way to victory, question marks and debates such as this will keep our democracy alive. And Michel, you talked about having the debate every 2 years. I think in democracy, a debate is a feature, not a bug. So I would strongly ask the audience to vote in a way that will show your support in our democracies.
Thank you very much, Colonel Bar-On. We very much appreciate your 2 minutes. And now it's over to you, Colonel Richard Kemp, if you would, arguing in the negative. You have 2 minutes to make your summary statement. Thank you very much, Colonel Kemp.
Thank you very much. And I would like to thank, in particular, my two opponents in this argument, because I believe, and I hope that the voters will note, that they actually made our case for us. I think their arguments confirm that democracies cannot win wars against terrorist organizations. And Professor Dershowitz's central kind of recommendation in his argument was a very laudable one that international democracies and non-democracies should combine to make it impossible for terrorists to win, to not reward them, to do everything possible to frustrate them. But of course, that is not a possibility. It has not happened ever in any era of conflict. It's not going to happen in the future. And I think that underlines one of the reasons why we can't actually win wars against terrorist organizations. So I thank Professor Dershowitz for making that point for us. And Colonel Bar-On made the suggestion that Israel has won the war against terrorism in Israel. It hasn't won it, unfortunately. I wish I could agree with you that it has. Israel has won some very, very impressive campaigns against terrorist organizations, but not the war. The war continues. I first met Benjamin Antony, or didn't first meet him, but I met Benjamin Antony on one occasion when he was going back into Gaza to mow the lawn there on the nth occasion, and it still happens. And Colonel Bar-On explained to us why Israel can't win, and that is because the defeat is going into defeat Hamas, for example, in Gaza is far too costly in terms of resources, funding, and democratic endurance of the Israeli people. So I think, again, I'm grateful to Colonel Bar-On for making that point for us. And I think I'll just leave you with a question. If democracies can win wars against terrorist organizations, why haven't they yet done so?
Thank you so very much, Colonel Richard Kemp, for that statement. And now our final debater with the final summary statement. Before we cast the vote, I'm delighted to bring back to the proverbial podium Professor Alan Dershowitz. You have 2 minutes, Professor.
Well, I think an appropriate ending is to ask what we agree about, what we disagree about. I think there's a lot of agreement that a war alone will not defeat terrorism, that it needs to be combined with law enforcement activities, with diplomacy, with economic, and with many other kinds of consideration. Clausewitz said that many, many years ago. My fundamental disagreement, though, is with my fellow professor, Paradis. He thinks that law enforcement alone, and he said that, law enforcement alone can defeat terrorism. No, it can't. Maybe it can defeat the weathermen. Maybe it can defeat small, local, domestic terrorist organizations. But to defeat regional and international television, you need to work together and use warfare as well as other kinds of pressures. And look, I agree with Colonel Kemp that right now you'll never get democracies and other countries to agree to set back terrorism. But I think that if military action can significantly destroy terrorist groups, and remember, they're not combatants. Terrorist groups are criminals. I agree with Professor Paradis. They are criminals, and we treat them as criminals in warfare because we make them unlawful combatants, subject to rules that are different than combatants are subject to. But my point is that if we combine tough, aggressive military action, war, declare war on terrorist groups, military war, target their leaders for assassination, make sure that they suffer consequences on the battlefield, that will help encourage other countries not to reward terrorism. So I think a means toward achieving my goal of never rewarding terrorism and always setting back terrorism is a strong military reaction to terrorism. So yes, democracies can defeat terrorist organizations militarily as long as they do it intelligently and in combination with other forms of pressure.
Thank you so very much, Professor Dershowitz. I appreciate your summary statement. And ladies and gentlemen, this is where you come into this debate and you can have your voices heard somewhat by casting your vote. We're now going to move to the second vote. You've heard the argumentation. It's been compelling in either direction. It's been informed by our moderators. This is the second vote. Please cast it right away. The question that you're being asked to vote upon, just to remind you, is can democracies win wars against terrorist organizations? Please bear with us as we tally the votes. Remember, after you have cast your vote, we will show you the result of the preliminary vote, and then we will declare the winner. One note of importance: the panel that has swung the needle the most will be declared the winner. Therefore, a given panel can still hold the majority percentage, but come out the loser in our debate. So let's continue to tally the votes, and everybody bear with us as we do so. Can democracies win wars against terrorist organizations? Yes or no?
Okay, so we are going to move into the previous vote. I'm going to display the vote that was taken at the beginning of the debate now. Okay. So as you can see, the first vote taken had a very decisive vote of 78% saying that yes, democracies can win wars against terrorist organizations, and 22% voting no. The final vote, I believe, came in at 49-51. So the decisive winner of tonight's debate goes towards Colonel Richard Kemp and Professor Michel Paradis.
Thank you very much indeed, Thomas. So we can see that the swing of the voters, and we can drop this, Thomas. Actually, if you can just bring back up the first vote so everyone can see it again, just for a first vote. And then if you can, that was 78% arguing it was supported the affirmative, 22% supportive of the negative. Now, if you can drop that, Thomas, and show everyone the second vote, we can see that the swing is clearly greatest in favor of Colonel Richard Kemp and Professor Michel Paradis. And that means that our winners this evening are the panel of Colonel Richard Kemp and Professor Michel Paradis, arguing in the negative to the question, can democracies win wars against terrorist organizations? Thomas, we can drop that screen share if you would. I just want to express my profound thanks to our debaters. I want to thank my colleague.
Benjamin, were we leading an assault on democracy this evening?
Well, listen, the audience has spoken, Colonel Bar-On.
I don't want to be a part of that.
Perhaps you'll come back and have a follow-up argument, a second round, if you would. By the way, Colonel Bar-On, a special thanks to you before I go. I don't know, what time is it over there in Israel now?
It's 2:02.
2:02. Okay, well, you can...
Let me be very clear that I will not be calling for a recount. I will not be challenging the election. I will not be hiring Rudy Giuliani to litigate the results. I think it was a fair election, fair result, and I congratulate my very distinguished opponents for making brilliant arguments.
Thank you very much indeed. Colonel Kemp, before I round up with some thank yous, and Professor Paradis, do you have anything to say quickly?
I would reiterate my great thanks to my opponents and my colleague and to you, and to also say that the real winner hopefully was everyone who watched this debate, because I think the most important thing we can do in a democracy is to air the issues as critically and as sharply as possible. And I think we've done that tonight. And so I hope everyone feels that they have won not as much as Colonel Kemp and I have won, but at least.
and Colonel Kemp, last
Thank
words.
you again. It's been a real pleasure, and I've particularly enjoyed debating with both my team partner and also my opponent.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. It's been a real privilege. I just want to say thank you, first and foremost, as ever I do, to my colleague and co-founder, Rosita Panini. Rosita, this would not be possible without you. Thank you so very much for your assistance. To our colleague in common, Mr. Alan Langer. Alan, we greatly appreciate all that you do to bring these about. To our moderators, to our debaters, rather, Professor Alan Dershowitz, Professor Michel Paradis, Colonel Richard Kemp, and Colonel Eli Bar-On. I can tell you I am personally enriched by way of the education and the wisdom and the experience that you imparted unto me and to our audience this evening. And I thank you for making your argumentation in such a compelling fashion. And I want to also thank our moderators, each and every one of you. Salam, Eric, Cade, and Daniel, thank you so very much for being with us. And thank you for your tremendous service to your countries, from one veteran to veterans entire. I greatly appreciate it. Finally, I want to thank our audience. Thank you so very much for being so active. Thank you for listening so attentively. Thank you for showing the willingness to not only come with an opinion to a debate, but actually to reconsider that opinion and to have your opinion perhaps changed, or at least to cast a vote in acknowledgement of whomever you believe is the most compelling debater or debating panel. It's a rare quality, and we celebrate it here at the MirYam Institute. I wish you a Laila Tov and a good night. Eli Bar-On, get some sleep. Over and out.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.